Have you ever wondered how medieval society actually worked? Who was in charge, who did the fighting, and who did all the hard work? It wasn't just kings and castles, it was a complex system of power and loyalty known as feudalism. Imagine a giant pyramid with the king sitting right at the very top. He was the ultimate boss, the one who technically owned all the land in the kingdom. But here's the thing, one person can't rule an entire kingdom all by himself. It's just too much land, too many people to manage. So, what did the king do? He did something pretty clever. He divided up his kingdom into large chunks of land called fiefs. And he gave these fiefs to the people he trusted most, the powerful nobles, the barons, and the bishops. These were the folks on the next level down in our pyramid. Now, these weren't just free gifts. In exchange for this land, the nobles had to promise a few very important things to the king. First and foremost was loyalty. They had to swear an oath of fealty, a solemn promise to be faithful to the king. They also had to provide the king with soldiers or knights whenever he needed to go to war. This was crucial as medieval kingdoms didn't have standing armies like we do today. So, when the king called, his nobles had to show up with their armed forces ready to fight. They also had to give the king money and advice when he asked for it. Essentially, they were the king's upper management team, helping him run the country. These powerful nobles lived in grand castles, symbols of their power and authority. They controlled their land, collected taxes from the people living on it, and administered justice. So, we have the king at the top and his powerful nobles just below. But the nobles had the same problem as the king. They had huge estates to manage. So, what did they do? They did the exact same thing the king did. They subdivided their land and gave smaller pieces to lesser nobles, who we know as knights. This is the next layer down in our pyramid. The knights were the professional warriors of the Middle Ages. They were the tanks of the medieval battlefield, clad in armor and trained from a young age in the art of combat. In return for their piece of land, called a manor, the knights had one primary job: to fight. They pledged their military service to the noble who gave them the land. When their lord called them to battle, whether it was for the king or for a local dispute, they had to be ready to go. They also had to protect the manor and the people who lived on it from any threats. The knights were the local law enforcement and the military presence all rolled into one. This whole system of giving land in exchange for service is the core of what we call feudalism. The land was the currency of power. The king granted land to nobles who in turn granted land to knights. Each person in this chain was a vassal to the person above them. A vassal is someone who holds land from a superior and in return owes them loyalty and service. So a noble was a vassal to the king, and a knight was a vassal to a noble. It was a chain of personal loyalty that held the entire kingdom together. Each person knew who they answered to and what was expected of them. This system provided stability and a way to raise an army quickly. It wasn't always a perfect system, of course. Ambitious nobles could become more powerful than the king, and rivalries between them could lead to civil wars. But for several centuries, this pyramid of power was the glue that held medieval European society together. Now, we've talked about the top 3 layers of the pyramid: the king, the nobles, and the knights. They make up maybe 10% of the population. So, what about everyone else? What about the other 90%? Well, they formed the massive base of the pyramid. These were the peasants, also known as serfs. The peasants were the engine of the medieval economy. They did all the work. They farmed the land, raised the livestock, baked the bread, and built the castles. Without them, the entire system would have collapsed. But unlike the people above them, peasants did not own any land. They lived and worked on the land that belonged to their lord, whether that was a knight, a noble, or the king himself. Life as a peasant was incredibly hard. They weren't slaves in the sense that they could be bought and sold individually, but they weren't exactly free either. A peasant was tied to the land. They couldn't leave the manor without the lord's permission. If the land was sold or given to a new lord, the peasants went with it. In exchange for a small strip of land to farm for their own family, peasants had to work on the lord's land for several days a week. This was called labor service. They planted and harvested the lord's crops, repaired his fences, and dug his ditches, all for free. On top of that, they had to pay taxes and fees for almost everything. They paid a tax to use the lord's mill to grind their grain, a tax to use his oven to bake their bread, and even a tax to get married. A portion of everything they produced, from grain to chickens, had to be given to the lord. Their lives were dominated by the seasons and the agricultural calendar. From sunrise to sunset, their days were filled with back-breaking physical labor. Their homes were simple one- or two-room huts, often shared with their animals. Their diet was basic, mostly consisting of bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables they could grow. Meat was a rare luxury. They had very few rights, and their lives were completely at the mercy of their lord. The lord of the manor was their judge and jury. If a peasant committed a crime or had a dispute, it was the lord who decided the outcome. Despite this harsh reality, the peasants were the foundation that supported the entire feudal structure. Their labor fed the knights who fought, the nobles who ruled, and the king who reigned over all. It was a system of mutual obligation, though the obligations were far from equal. The top of the pyramid enjoyed power, wealth, and privilege, while the bottom endured a life of toil and servitude. So, let's recap our pyramid. At the very top, you have the monarch, the king or queen who owns all the land. Below them are the tenants-in-chief, the powerful barons and bishops who receive large fiefs from the king in exchange for money and knights. Below them are the knights, the warrior class, who receive manors from the nobles in exchange for military service. And at the very bottom, forming the huge, solid base, are the peasants and serfs who have no land of their own but work the land for everyone else in exchange for protection and a place to live. It was a rigid social structure. You were born into your place in the pyramid. And for the vast majority of people, that's where you stayed for your entire life. A peasant's son would be a peasant, and a knight's son would train to be a knight. However, it's important to remember that this is a simplified model. The reality on the ground could be much messy. A person could be both a vassal and a lord. For example, a knight might hold land from two different nobles, meaning he owed military service to both of them. What happens if his two lords go to war with each other? It got complicated. The church also played a massive role, acting as a powerful landowner itself, with its own hierarchy that mirrored the feudal pyramid, with the pope in a position similar to a king. But as a way to understand the basic flow of power, loyalty, and land in the Middle Ages, the feudal pyramid is an incredibly useful tool. It shows how a society without modern technology, communication, or government managed to organize itself, maintain order, and defend its borders for hundreds of years. From the solitary king at the peak to the millions of peasants at the base, each person had a role to play in the grand, complex structure of medieval feudalism. Thanks for watching. If you found this journey back in time interesting, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments which historical system you'd like to explore next.